Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. If you've been following American politics lately, you've probably noticed something interesting. The real battleground is no longer just candidates, campaigns, or even ideology. Increasingly, the fight is about the rules of the game itself, how elections are conducted, how votes are counted, and how political power is structured before a single ballot is cast. And right now, two major legal battles moving through the U.S. Supreme Court could fundamentally reshape those rules. Not in some abstract, theoretical way, but in ways that could directly impact the outcome of the next election cycle and beyond. So what's actually at stake here, and why are these cases drawing so much attention from both sides of the political spectrum? Let's break it down. At the center of the first case is a deceptively simple question: when should a vote count? Specifically, the court is examining laws in states like Mississippi that allow mail-in ballots to be counted even if they arrive after Election Day, as long as they're postmarked on or before that day. On paper, this might seem reasonable. After all, if someone mailed their ballot on time, why should delays in the postal system disenfranchise them? But critics argue that this approach opens the door to uncertainty, inconsistency, and, perhaps most importantly, a loss of public confidence. Think about how modern elections unfold. On election night, the public expects clarity, media outlets project winners, candidates deliver speeches, narratives begin to solidify. But if significant numbers of ballots continue to arrive and be counted days after the election, those early conclusions can shift. And when outcomes shift, trust becomes fragile. We've seen scenarios, especially in closely contested races, where a candidate appears to be ahead on election night, only to lose days later as additional ballots are counted. Whether those ballots are legitimate or not, the perception alone can be politically explosive. This is where the legal debate becomes more than just technical, it becomes psychological. Supporters of stricter deadlines argue that elections should have a clear endpoint. They say that extending counting periods, 5 days, 10 days, even longer in some states, creates opportunities for confusion and fuels suspicion, regardless of whether wrongdoing actually occurs. They also raise practical concerns. For example, what happens if postmarks are missing, illegible, or disputed? What standards are used to verify them? How consistent are those standards across jurisdictions? In a system as decentralized as the American electoral system, even small inconsistencies can become magnified. On the other side, defenders of extended ballot deadlines argue that the goal of an election is not speed, but accuracy and inclusiveness. They point out that many voters, especially military personnel overseas, rural residents, or individuals with limited mobility, depend on mail-in voting. Strict cutoffs, they argue, risk disenfranchising legitimate voters for reasons beyond their control. So the court isn't just deciding a procedural issue. It's weighing two competing values, certainty versus access, and depending on how it rules, the impact could be immediate. If the court sides with stricter interpretations, requiring ballots to be received by Election Day rather than merely postmarked, it could force multiple states to change their election laws. That, in turn, could alter how campaigns are run, how voters behave, and ultimately, who wins close races. Now, let's turn to the second major issue, which may be even more consequential in the long run: how electoral districts are drawn. This case centers on the use of race in redistricting, particularly under the framework of the Voting Rights Act. To understand the stakes, you have to go back to the 1960s. The Voting Rights Act was designed to address systemic racial discrimination in voting. One of its key provisions aimed to ensure that minority communities, especially black voters in the South, had a fair opportunity to elect representatives of their choice. Over time, this led to the creation of so-called majority-minority districts, where a specific racial or ethnic group makes up a majority of the electorate. The logic was straightforward. If minority voters were consistently being outvoted in broader districts, concentrating them in certain districts would give them a stronger political voice. For decades, this approach has been both defended and criticized. Supporters argue that without these protections, minority representation would decline and the political system would fail to reflect the diversity of the country. Critics, however, argue that drawing districts based on race, even for well-intentioned reasons, undermines the principle of equal treatment under the law. They say it reinforces racial divisions and can lead to a kind of political segregation, where representatives are seen as speaking primarily for one group rather than for all constituents. The current case asks a fundamental question: has the original justification for these policies expired? In other words, is it still necessary or even constitutional to rely on race as a primary factor in drawing electoral districts? Some of the justices appear to be grappling with the idea that what may have been justified in 1965 might not be justified today. They've raised the possibility that certain provisions of the Voting Rights Act were always intended as temporary remedies, not permanent fixtures. If the court agrees with that reasoning, the consequences could be profound. States might no longer be required, or even allowed to draw districts specifically designed to ensure minority representation. That could lead to a significant reconfiguration of the political map. And here's where things get politically sensitive. In many parts of the country, majority-minority districts tend to elect Democratic candidates. So changes to how those districts are drawn could shift the balance of power, not just in one election, but over an entire decade. But again, it's not just about partisan advantage, at least not on the surface. At its core, this debate is about competing visions of fairness. One vision says fairness means treating individuals without regard to race, even if that leads to unequal outcomes. The other says fairness sometimes requires acknowledging historical and structural inequalities, even if that means treating groups differently. The Supreme Court is now being asked to decide where that line should be drawn. When you put these two cases together, the rules around mail-in voting and the rules around districting, you start to see a bigger picture. These aren't isolated disputes. They're part of a broader struggle over how democracy should function in a deeply divided society. Should the system prioritize simplicity and finality, or flexibility and inclusiveness? Should it aim for formal equality or substantive representation? And perhaps most importantly, how much uncertainty can a democratic system tolerate before public trust begins to erode? One of the most underappreciated aspects of elections is that legitimacy doesn't come solely from legal compliance. It comes from perception. An election can be technically flawless and still be widely questioned if large segments of the population don't trust the process. That's why these legal battles matter so much. Because whatever the court decides, it won't just change the rules. It will shape how Americans interpret the outcomes produced by those rules. If deadlines are tightened, some voters may feel excluded. If deadlines are extended, others may feel the system is too open to manipulation. If race-based districting is curtailed, some will see it as a return to neutrality. Others will see it as a rollback of hard-won protections. There are no easy answers here, and that's what makes this moment so significant. We're not just watching legal arguments unfold. We're watching a negotiation over the future of American democracy itself. Now, does this mean that one party will automatically benefit? Not necessarily. While it's true that certain reforms may appear to advantage one side in the short term, political systems are dynamic. Parties adapt. Strategies evolve. Voter behavior changes. What looks like a structural advantage today can become a liability tomorrow. But what is clear is this: the stakes are high, and the consequences will be long-lasting. So as these cases move forward, it's worth paying attention, not just to the headlines, but to the underlying principles being debated. Because in the end, elections aren't just about who wins. They're about how the game is played. And right now, the rules of that game are very much up for debate. Thanks for watching.